So welcome back, everybody, to the Big Cat Sanctuary, where we're going to go for our first conservation conversation debate. And we're joined today by Ian Jones, who's head of Carnivores at Paradise Wildlife Park, the Zoological Society of Hertfordshire. Mr. Giles Clark, who's our Director of Cats and Conservation. And Chris Sheppard, who's the founder of Monitor. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello.
So for the guys at home, this is going to be a new series for us of conservation conversation debates. So we've had presentations at the Big Cat Sanctuary from some of our conservation partners. This is a new series where we want to explore some of the issues that are facing animals out there and the animal kingdom, and also, you know, the frontline people that are working in conservation. So we want to explore how that's affecting the work that they're doing, and how you guys at home as supporters can maybe get involved and have an impact on what's going on out there. So, and our first topic is the illegal wildlife trade. Now, you guys would have seen Ian, I think, and Giles about. Ian's obviously been doing our Facebook Lives from the park, and Giles, well, he's been on the telly a lot. So if you don't recognise his face, then you should do. And obviously, part of the day today, you've got a chance to see Big Cats About the House again. You can download by joining Team Spots and Stripes, so you can see Giles and Mayor and Willow all over again today. But Chris, you may not have met before, and like I say, Chris is the founder of Monitor. So I'm just going to hand over to Chris for a second, so you can maybe explain a little bit more about what Monitor are and what they do. Chris, over to you.
Sure, thanks. I've been working on wildlife trade for about 25 years, largely focused in Southeast Asia. 3 years ago, I established the organization Monitor with the focus of looking at species and issues that other organizations or people aren't looking at species that need more attention. A lot of species are being wiped out and being decimated by the illegal wildlife trade without anyone even realizing this is happening, or even a lot of the species, no one's even heard of them. So these are the species we're trying to support and to help out and to protect from the illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade.
That's amazing. Thank you. And yeah, obviously for us, you know, big cats are the focus, but with most of the conservation work we support, we like to take that holistic approach. We like to work with organisations that it may be the catalyst is the cat that's there, but obviously they're including the entire ecosystem, including the human beings that are involved and looking at alternative livelihoods. So it's fantastic to have you with us, Chris. With that though, I think we probably will start off with a more familiar cat for the people that are out there. So maybe the tiger. And I know, Giles, you've got some experience with that and the illegal wildlife trade based around tigers. So maybe, Giles, I can ask you, what's the current situation with tigers and the illegal wildlife trade out there?
The one thing when we talk about a species, you know, even as one that's as well known and as popular and as charismatic as the tiger, it's always really hard, and the media are always the first to do this. They, you know, people want to grab onto numbers. How many did there used to be? How many are left? You know, in terms of years, do they have left, etc., etc. And it's really, really difficult to accurately be able to, you know, pinpoint these populations. You know, you need to take in all the information when we look at a species in terms of its habitat, how much habitat is left, and all the other pressures, as well as obviously one of those pressures being the illegal wildlife trade. So when we talk about tigers, you know, the first sort of tiger crisis, if you like, came to our attention way back in the early 70s. You know, that's when we realized that their numbers were estimated to be below 2,000 at that particular time in India. Now, realistically, that was probably an underestimation, but we certainly were aware that, you know, without intervention, they were going to disappear. And that's over the decades now being replicated across the whole of their range. If you think about tigers as a species, it's split into different subspecies. We've already lost several of those. So when it comes to the pressure of the illegal wildlife trade, it's driven by the demand for their bones, their body parts in the best part. In some countries, it could be things like their meat, which is consumed, or their skins or their pelts, so to speak, are in demand. So you have different demands in different regions of the world, but far and above anywhere else, it's probably the demand. And Chris could, talk with a lot more experience firsthand than what I can of this, but it's the demand for their bones and their body parts going over to China and the Far East and Vietnam that's really, really, pushing them to the edge of extinction, coupled with those other pressures, if you like. And so I think, this might be a good time just to quickly touch on the fact that to try and combat that, some countries have historically set up what is effectively farms. So you have a tiger farm, which is producing hundreds, if not thousands, of individual tigers that are obviously bred and then are slaughtered like a factory, animal, like a industrial farm animal, and those products then enter the trade to try and reduce the demand from the wild. But there's all sorts of problems with that. First of all, not only just ethically and morally, and from a welfare perspective of those individual animals, but actually what you tend to find is when we do that with a species, all it does is increase the demand for their wild counterparts. It increases, confusion within the consumers, etc., etc. What's illegal, what isn't illegal. So,
really interesting. Yeah, I just think, Chris, just to bring you in there. So, what's your thought? Giles has mentioned about that, about strategies like farming on the ground. Have you seen that work anywhere with not just tigers, but with any sort of illegal trade with animals?
Yeah, we've looked at farming issues and commercial captive breeding issues for a wide variety of species, largely in Southeast Asia. And to be honest, I haven't seen one example. I can't give you one example of where commercial farming or commercial captive breeding of wildlife has had any benefit for wild populations or the conservation of wild populations. We like to say commercial captive breeding is a conservation tool. I don't buy that. It's in many cases it's a good business. A lot of animals do breed well in captivity. Tigers breed well in captivity, but there's no evidence showing that these farms are taking pressure off wild populations. Poaching levels are not going down. Demand for wild taken tiger parts is not disappearing. It's not being replaced by the farming and by the commercial breeding. We've looked at this with tigers. We've looked at this with Asiatic black bears, with tokay geckos, with a huge range of bird species. And within Southeast Asia, there's no evidence that this is helpful at all. In fact, it's probably detrimental. Opening up captive breeding and commercial captive breeding and farming creates opportunities for laundering of wild-caught species, wild-caught animals into the global market. Laundering is a huge problem. Millions of animals are laundered into the international market every year. It creates opportunities for corruption. Organized criminal syndicates running the wildlife trade rely on corruption to facilitate their trade. Farming opens all kinds of doors for corruption, and it seems to send the wrong message to consumers. If it can be bred in captivity, well, then conservation for wild populations is no longer a priority, and in some cases it seems to have even stimulated the demand and created an increased demand for these wild animals.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a crazy situation. So just throwing that over to you, Ian. I mean, back home, and you get, in a normal situation, obviously not now we're in lockdown, but in a normal situation, you get thousands of members of the general public coming through to Paradise Wildlife Park, and I know you've got some education programs coming through there. But do you get a sense from the British public that they're aware of this situation with illegal wildlife trade?
Well, I think everyone seems to be aware that there are problems and tigers and lots of animals are under threat. And, I think there's a problem with the fact that, it's not right there in front of them. If you can't see it, it seems to be a bit of a harder problem for people to get to grips with. I think the last 10 years alone, wildlife agencies have said that at least 1/3 of tiger parts that have been seized in the last 10 years have actually come from captive breeding, whether that's been legal tiger farms in countries that didn't sign the CITES, or whether that is from illegal places, and it is happening all over the world. Luckily I don't think we've ever had it in Britain, so people don't think about it as much with tigers in the UK, but there is problems with the pet trade, and there is problems with illegal breeding and the exotic pet trade in the UK especially, and most people don't see it. I mean, I could go onto Facebook right now and probably find you a cheetah or a serval that could be shipped to the UK, and even get around, having a DWA license. And these all contribute to the problems that most people just aren't aware of. They think because in the UK we're animal lovers, it doesn't happen over here. But I think we're heavily involved in it. And I think, there's corruption in governments all over the world. There's corruption in a lot of countries all over the world where wildlife is disappearing. And, this is all contributing to that wildlife trade problem.
Yeah, it's difficult, right? Because, if people aren't aware, but also I think, Giles, you've said this in the past, if we're talking about tigers, it's like one of the iconic animals, the most popular animal on the planet, probably. And if we can't do something about that trade, then, as Chris said, it's not just those big cats, it's so many other different animals. And you mentioned the Asiatic bear, actually. I think, Giles, you've got experience of seeing that when you were out filming in Asia recently.
Exactly. So last year, as you guys know, I spent pretty much the whole year in Laos in particular, but also across several other countries. And I would go into markets and see wildlife for sale on a almost daily basis. But also you could go into shops, and you did not have to look very hard to come across very well organized, commercially packed wildlife products. So that included bear bile, which is what I was looking for at the time. And this one particular shop I went into was an entire wall was devoted to tiger products made from tiger bone wine, etc., etc. And it was, although I'm fully aware of it, it was still so unbelievably shocking to see it on the scale, but also just how well structured and organized it was. These weren't, recycled glass bottles. These were commercially produced labels, packaging, very well advertised. And so it gives you an idea. And that's part of the challenge, is that, when we talk about the illegal wildlife trade, it's exactly that. And it's illegal, but it's run by criminal networks and syndicates that are incredibly well funded and driven and motivated because of just how much it's worth.
Yeah, it's said to be the third biggest illegal trade, right, across the planet. So, so going back to you, Chris, we've talked about farming, not necessarily a viable solution. We need to educate people, sure, but what solutions are there out there that you think might be viable?
Very good question. I don't think there's a single answer for that. I think dealing with this problem is going to require a multi-pronged approach. You mentioned education. Education and awareness is really important. I think ignorance of the issue, people are just not aware of the issue or think it's something that happens somewhere else, is probably our greatest obstacle in conservation when it comes to dealing with the wildlife trade and the consumers that are fueling the wildlife trade. A lot of people are involved in fueling the wildlife trade and supporting the demand without even realizing it. You might go to a pet shop and see some tortoises there that, while they're in a pet shop, it must be legal, but really do your homework. They're probably, there's a good chance they're not legal. Your snakeskin bag or boots, sure, you bought them at a legal shop, but they may have been sourced illegally in the country of origin. Giles mentioned manufactured bear bile medicine. It's in a reputable shop must be legal, but it's not. There's no legal international trade in medicines even claiming to contain bear bile. So consumers really need to educate themselves and educate other people around them. Everyone has a role to play. It's not something for other people to do and something that happens in other countries. It's happening everywhere. Everyone can play a part. Educate yourself, become a smart consumer, educate other people, support conservation initiatives, and you know, it's almost a cliche, but be as green as you can.
Yeah, great. Would you agree with that, Ian?
Yeah, 100%. You know, education is definitely going to be key. I think when you've got things like traditional Asiatic medicines that we know have absolutely no medicinal purpose whatsoever, they don't cure anything. You know, and people can take different parts of the tiger, for example, for, you know, anything from toothache to headache to even curing nightmares in some cases. You know, so it's a shame that we're using this product, and I think you need to get through to the next and the younger generation coming through, and that's where education will definitely come in and be key. You know, if you can educate a next generation, they hopefully will grow up with different beliefs that maybe their fathers and their grandparents did, and that then will reduce the need for it. I think also, you know, there needs to be tighter restrictions on licensing as a global effort. The problem you get is different countries have different governments, and they all have their own different rules and laws. And until we, you know, even when it's illegal to trade in a lot of animal parts, not all countries are signed up to these things. And it just, if you can't license it and put in strict and good punishment for actually catching people, there's always going to be a problem. You can take, you know, the top person out of a criminal organisation, and sadly there's going to be someone ready to step into that again. So I think reducing the demand through education is probably going to be key to stopping that.
Sure. Okay. I mean, so moving on, one of the things I wanted to talk about is obviously people, and it's been in the news, we've seen it slightly, haven't seen a major focus on it really recently, but obviously we're all in a situation here where we're talking to each other on new technology due to COVID-19. But that has been said to have started in, you know, the wet markets in China, and, you know, the consumption of animals through that trade. I mean, how real is that in your guys' thoughts? Giles, what do you think?
I think the evidence speaks for itself. If we look at historically the other viruses that have come out of these similar situations, these similar markets, whether they're wet markets or wildlife markets, what we've looked at with the likes of SARS and Ebola, you know, even historically, HIV has thought to have been a zoonotic disease that has come from wildlife and crossed over to people. But it's not, you know, the one thing I will always stress, it's not the wildlife's fault. It's the fact that we have created the circumstances and the situation for, you know, to allow that viruses, those diseases, to cross from species to species, and then ultimately, eventually, you know, humans. If you've ever, you know, and I can still remember now, as I'm sure, you know, Chris, going back even, you know, before I did, but I can remember my very first wildlife market. And no matter how many I see, you know, the horror never gets any easier to deal with, where you're talking about hundreds or sometimes thousands of animals that are stacked, literally stacked in diabolical cages and conditions on top of each other, you know, and you're talking about immense stress where they start to then shed different viruses, as well as, you know, all the feces and urine, which then allows, you know, contact that otherwise just normally wouldn't happen. And then the hygiene conditions that people are then put into in those markets, not only the people that are operating the stores and the market, but also then obviously the customers as well. It's just, you know, it's just an accident waiting to happen. And that's why, you know, it's imperative. If there's one silver lining to this current crisis, I hope it really starts to throw the spotlight on the wildlife trade and the way in which we treat, you know, wildlife. And when, you know, people are very it's not about, there's wet markets all around the world. You can go to New York and find wet markets. A wet market defines, somewhere that sells fresh produce. But there's a difference between selling, hygienically sourced and dealt with chicken and fruit and vegetables, to then having thousands and thousands of animals that have been wild caught and or bred in these factory farm conditions, and allow that situation to arise again. So,
Sure.
as I said, I think it's something that we really, and it's, you can understand the amount of suffering that has happened in the last 4-5 months around the world, but it will happen again unless we change our ways, and wildlife markets need to be put in the spotlight.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds very, very real. And your experience, Chris, as Giles says, that backs it up out in the wild then.
Yeah, I've been to a lot of wildlife markets. They're disgusting. It is amazing that we've not had global pandemics like this more frequently. And as Giles said, it's going to happen again as long as these markets are permitted to exist and continue to operate in the way they do, with live animals stacked on dead animals, animals being slaughtered on the spot, no refrigeration, very, very unhygienic conditions. As Giles pointed out, the one silver lining hopefully will be that these markets, the way wildlife is treated, the way wildlife is viewed, and these markets change. Policies need to be put in place now. I'm afraid that once this pandemic gets under control, people will just go back to the way things were, and we just will be sitting waiting for the next one. These markets need to be closed, and I know there's a lot of pro-wildlife trade activists out there screaming and yelling about the problems with bans and the problems with shutting wildlife trade down, et cetera, et cetera. The things have to change. These markets have to be closed down. The wildlife trade has to become a higher priority, and it's not something that we just have to deal with in China. There's wild meat markets everywhere. People eat wildlife everywhere, and the way that's handled and the way that's regulated needs to be put in the spotlight and improved.
Yeah.
The one thing I'd add to that, though, is that we should point out that for a vast majority of these type of markets, it's not about the substance in terms of wildlife has to be consumed because there's no other alternatives. And there are a few examples where bushmeat is their source of protein. But so many of these markets, like I went through several markets last year where wildlife was offered for sale, and 10-15 meters down the same alleyway, you could buy farmed chicken for a fraction of the price as what you could buy the tortoise or the small primate or the wild caught snake, etc. Quite often what you find in these markets, it's about people demonstrating that they have the money and the resources, and so therefore they will. It's not solely about food.
Yeah, I guess you've got the cultural drives. You've got, again, the fact that you can, if you're serving tiger bone tea or wine in your house, then you can get hold of it. You can afford it, so it's a measure of wealth.
But the reality,
go on, Ian. So
the reality of it is, if we keep treating wildlife and using wildlife and hunting wildlife for food the way we are at the moment, in 50 years it won't be there. There have to be an alternative. So why not find the alternative now, before wildlife is gone? Because if we keep overfishing, hunting all these areas to extinction, most of these animals are under threat anyway. At least 50% of the world's species are under threat at the moment, and if we carry on in this kind of trend, it won't be there for the next generation. So there'll have to be an alternative, and we need to find it now and put it in place, and then you don't need to use these wildlife markets, and hopefully again that brings you further away from the disease all over again. These diseases are coming about basically because we're closer to wildlife than we've ever been before, and wildlife is in small isolated pockets compared to what it was a few hundred years ago, meaning these diseases spread more rapidly throughout wildlife as well as then back into the human side of it as well.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe we've all mentioned it, and maybe the silver lining, as we said, out of this situation that we're in is maybe it is a wake-up call for people. You know, it's put us into lockdown, this virus. You know, people have changed their attitudes to consumption, hopefully. They've maybe just, you know, made themselves closer to their families and seen what's more important than flying and zooming around the world and consuming everything in sight. So let's hope that brings us to a different world when we reach the other side. So another topic we wanted to bring in, because we talk a lot about, or we hear a lot about, you know, the trade in wildlife animal parts and, you know, them being used for consumption. But we've talked a little bit, touched on it, about the live wildlife trade. And I think, Giles, again, just recently, I mean, you were out in Somaliland working with the Cheetah Conservation Fund, and I mean, there's live trafficking of cheetah cubs out there, right?
I know exactly. So all wildlife trade, I find, is barbaric, and you know, and ultimately starts off with and ends with suffering of the individual animal. But these cheetahs, the demand for cheetahs is slightly different than probably most other species of cat, in the fact that there's a real demand for live cubs in the Middle East. And so what's happening is cubs are being sourced out of the Horn of Africa, so northern Kenya, Ethiopia, in that region, and then being trafficked across land until Somaliland, where they're then taken across the Sea of Aden and start their journey on the other side to whatever the destination country is. And it's absolutely barbaric. You know, like, I would suggest that maybe 75% of cubs probably don't even make it across to the Middle East, and then others would still perish on the other side. So when I visited what we call the Cheetah Safe House in Hargeisa in Somaliland, CCF at that time were looking after 38 cheetah cubs that were under 16 months of age. Most of them were, you know, tiny, almost neonatal little fellas. So again, it really does, you know, highlight a different aspect to the trade. And if that particular element continues at that rate, then their cheetahs will be viably extinct within the Horn of Africa within a few years, because nearly every single cub that, you know, cheetahs have it incredibly tough in the wild. Even though they're a big cat, they're not as robust as the likes of a leopard or a lion, and quite often will succumb to just natural issues and other predators. So the fact that there's this huge demand, and effectively they end up as trophy pets, you know, which is even more disgusting.
Yeah, no, horrible to see. So, and Ian, I think you touched on it earlier. I mean, the exotic pet trade is still a thing in the UK. You said that seems really, really hard to believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was only last year where they found an actual tiger farm in the Czech Republic. And what we need to do is definitely put tougher licensing for all animals, you know, all over the world for keeping exotic pets as or exotic animals as pets. You know, I can't look at a Facebook feed at the moment without seeing a serval, pet monkeys. You know, even if it's rare, snakes and things like that, you're seeing them all over the place today. And, you know, actually social media is driving it even more. People are getting further away from realizing that it's wrong. And, you know, these programs glamorize, you know, keeping these animals as pets like that, which again is just fueling that trade. And sadly, the internet these days, if you've got enough money, you can get and have whatever you want. And that seems to be a major problem with it as well.
Yeah, sounds like it. And Chris, I just wanted to touch on, because right back at the beginning, you said obviously part of Monitor's ethos is to look at sort of lesser known species. You know, we talked about tigers, touched on bears, but so maybe a chance to highlight some of the animals that people won't be aware about that are being trafficked.
Yeah, well, the live animal trade, the pet trade, involves far more species than the bushmeat trade or the wild meat trade or the traditional medicine trade. there's thousands of species traded for pets and collectors, everything from rare species of beetles to big cats, everything. We've looked at bird markets, songbird markets in Indonesia, and in the capital city of Jakarta, we surveyed one large market there, 3 large markets. It took us 3 days to count the 19,000 songbirds that we observed there of a few hundred different species. One of our main focus right now is looking at the songbird trade, because it involves millions and millions of wild-caught birds every year. Mortality rates are incredibly high. Captive breeding of some species is starting up, and in some cases it's already turning into a laundering issue. There's some species that are now extinct in the wild and only exist in these commercial farms. So, but people aren't aware of this. The songbird trade is huge. Another one, and a lot of these birds from Asia are showing up in Europe. It's not just an Asian market issue. Reptiles is another big one. Pet reptile trade is enormous and worth billions of dollars. It's completely out of control. There's species of turtles and tortoises that are for sale, as was mentioned, online everywhere. You can get any species of tortoise online, even the rare plowshare tortoises from Madagascar. We could find them online and get those. Anything's available. But again, people aren't aware. These pet reptile markets, pet amphibians, pet birds. These are massive trades, massive problems, massive conservation issues. Most people haven't heard of them, and therefore organizations working on these species aren't getting the support they need, the backup or the funding or anything, because we're working on species that no one's heard about and therefore few people even care about.
Yeah,
so it's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
One of the officers at Gatwick who deal with wildlife coming in through our major airports, got Heathrow and Gatwick, 2 of the busiest airports in the world. And from what they were seizing, they think that that's probably only 1/5 of what's actually being smuggled through. So the amount of animals that they are seizing, and I know Giles and me at the parks here have both had phone calls from Heathrow saying that they seized cheetah with no passport, no records of them coming in. So they were smuggling them in through these busy airports. And it just shows you how easy these criminals are doing, how much money must be in it for them to be taking those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's a real problem. It's global. It's and it sounds though like what we can do about it is awareness, and hopefully we're doing a bit of that today, talking to the guys that are out there watching on Facebook Live as part of our Spots and Stripes Day. But it needs to go further than that, right? So education at the bottom of it, but awareness of the whole situation. I'm aware now also that we're running out a bit of time, gents, so we've got to sign off in a second, but maybe if you can just go around, starting with you, Giles, just a little bit of a summary about where you think where we are and what the situation is, and just how can people help?
Well, to do that in 30 seconds is not going to be easy, but where we are is we're at the edge of the cliff, and we've got some choices to make, but I would say that it's not too late. The one thing that I always take away when we talk about these different species is that they are still hanging on, especially cats. We know that they're incredibly robust and resilient for the best part. So, but we don't have the luxury of time anymore. We're not talking about decades. And that's where, yes, education is important, but we need action now, because it will be too late if we wait for the next generation. So what can people do? Well, the obvious one, and it sounds so cliche, is to support organizations that are working on the front line, whether that's organizations like Monitor and what Chris does, or some of our other conservation partners at the Big Cat Sanctuary. But beyond that, and also looking at the current crisis that we have, it's about people need to connect. We need to now really take stock of what's happened and treat the natural world with the respect and compassion that it deserves.
Yeah, great. Any last messages from you, Ian, on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think people need to just kind of look at everything, all the products they're buying, try and make sure that you're buying products that are sustainably resourced, and that you can follow up on where these companies that you're supporting are also getting their products from, whether it's actual, problems with human trade and people using child labour and things, as well as decimating wild areas. They're all linked. So, everything that Giles said, and just please look at sustainably resourced products that you're buying.
Great. And last word to you, Chris, out there in Canada. Thank you for joining us. But any last message that you'd like to get across to everybody?
Oh, well, thank you for this opportunity. It's great. I think, as the other guys have said, education, awareness is important, but this really is a time for action, or it's going to be too late. We've already lost a lot of species. There's no excuse to lose anymore. But people need to act, support conservation organizations, support those kind of efforts, but also call upon your own governments to improve legislation and tighten up enforcement. A lot of countries have very weak, very poor legislation when it comes to controlling the trade in wildlife that's been illegally sourced in the countries of origin. Once it's in the market, there's very little authorities can do in many cases, and these kind of policies and laws need to be looked at and addressed, and it's up to the public to start making noise about that and demanding change and demanding more action against this illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade. Everyone can do something. Everyone can support conservation projects. Skip a coffee or a beer this week and donate that money to a conservation project. Every little bit helps, and everyone can do that.
Yeah, great. Strong message from everybody, and I think that's right. We're not alone. We can all work together. We've seen that in the situation we're in at the moment, and consumer power has got the power to change the way people do stuff and the way governments put together their policies. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for our very first conservation conversation. We're hoping to be many more, and we're going to sign off now and head back to the Big Cat Sanctuary, where we got some more fun and games to lighten up the mood a little bit, but add some fun. But also, people can donate today as well. So if you go to the Big Cat Support Fund, you'll not only be caring for the cats that we have obviously here at the Big Cat Sanctuary and the Paradise Wildlife Park Zoological Society of Hertfordshire, but actually, absolutely, we want to forge forward and fund more conservation work, supporting partners out in the field like Chris and his amazing work that he's doing. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for donating if you can. And we'll see you again soon for another conservation conversation. Goodbye.